This is a production of Cornell University.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the push-pull systems, which are in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think this is a really interesting example of ecological intensification as an approach to solving the challenges of production. And so many of you know that this really is my first time being involved in research in a developing country in smallholder subsistence farming systems. I've traveled to many countries for workshops, but this is what I decided would be really interesting to become involved in for my yeah. So I'm going to just speak briefly about ecological intensification as a framework and an alternative path for addressing some of the challenges in agriculture, an introduction and a tour of push-pull systems. Some of my preliminary research results, so this research is so far being conducted on Fulbright funding, which is rather limited for actual data analysis, and then some future directions and the collaborations that have come out of this. So we know we're facing some big challenges in agriculture, and I really don't have to go over them for this group. And there are many solutions that are being proposed, and we can sort of think of them as a continuum, starting with more crop per drop. So the idea that we continue on our current path and improve the efficiency of the resources that we're using. Another alternative that's proposed is ecological intensification. So this idea of restoring ecological integrity as a way to address some of the problems. And there's many sort of a continuum in the middle. And in reality, we're going to need to draw from both of these approaches. So I don't see them as mutually exclusive. So I'm an ecologist, so I'm particularly interested in looking at ecological intensification and trying to learn more about how far can we push these approaches. And the central hypothesis of this approach is that we could use biodiversity to enhance and restore some of the ecological processes that support yields and productivity, and be able to reduce the fossil fuel-based inputs that we're using. So address some of these issues of environmental degradation and also food security at the same time. So there is some evidence that in going in this in the trajectory towards intensification and the amazing increases in yields that have been achieved, that there have been reductions in biodiversity. I'm talking mostly about plant diversity, which then has these cascading effects on arthropods and the below ground communities. So one graph is from the Midwestern US, the corn soybean belt, over a number of decades. And then another is some work that was done in Germany looking at plant diversity on a somewhat smaller scale. And this trend can be found in many other landscapes, that as you intensify, you increase the tendency towards monocultures, either continuous monocultures or maybe alternating two crops. But you have extensive landscapes mostly in the same species or one or two species. And this kind of intensification was enabled by replacing the ecosystem services that were once delivered by plants, for example, nitrogen fixation or weed control. So as perennials and other species are removed, we can use fertilizers, we can use herbicides to actually increase yields even in the, without using that plant diversity for those outcomes. And so the question is, can we go in the opposite direction? Can we increase plant diversity and have an impact on how much energy, and I'm using it as a proxy for inputs, on the inputs that we're using? Can we go in this direction? Can we get tangible benefits by managing plant diversity at multiple scales, so within the field, the farm, and across landscapes? And there is some evidence that links biodiversity, both in space and time, to improvements in yield. There have been a few studies that have actually looked at some energy biodiversity relationships. And I'm just going to put up 3 examples here. One's in Africa, in the same sort of region, where they were looking at biodiversity both in terms of intercropping and rotation and its impact on yields. And another study that came out, it mainly focuses on pollination. And I would say that pollination as an ecosystem service and the impact on those crops that require pollinators is probably the best example and the most studied case where we can link biodiversity across landscapes and at farm scale to concrete benefits in yields. And we can go in either direction. Some people study landscapes and look at how homogeneous does a landscape need to become before it impacts yield negatively. They find as you get to landscapes that have fewer and fewer kinds of species, plants, and habitats, you have reduced abundance and numbers of pollinators and reduced yields in the pollination-dependent crops. These are going the opposite direction. And then the most recent study, which was carried out across many regions on multiple continents, found this very strong relationship between plant biodiversity, pollinator diversity and abundance, and yields. And it did vary depending on the size of the farm. So there's some intricacies in here that the entomologists care about. But this is just suggesting that we need to understand more about these processes and look at how far can we push it and how can we use these methods to complement the inputs that we're using. And this is particularly important for those smallholder systems where they don't have the resources at this point to purchase all of these inputs. So I have been aware of the push-pull intercropping system for a long time. I used it in my agroecology course as an example of where multiple ecological mechanisms are used to manage pests. And this is Zair Khan, who's the scientist who's been working on the system for 20 years, and he developed it along with a number of collaborators, some at Rothamsted in particular. And this system was developed by SIPE, which is a small NGO that's based in Kenya and works in the region of sub-Saharan Africa. So he's SIPE is my host institution in Kenya, and Zair Khan is my main collaborator. So just a little geography. Here's Kenya straddling the equator. I had never been there before I went to actually start working and visiting these farms. Isipe is located over in western Kenya, with the red X's right on the shores of Lake Victoria. And that's their second research campus. They also have an office in Nairobi. And then the area where they work is this region of western Kenya, which is a semi-humid tropical climate. There's quite a lot of variation in the rainfall that actually occurs there, anywhere from 800 to 1,600 millimeters. And in most locations, it's a bimodal distribution, so there's 2 growing seasons. However, very far up north, there's one long rainy season up near Kitale in their northernmost border of the area they work in. So there are farmers using push-pull systems in other parts of Kenya and also in other sub-Saharan countries, but the most of them are concentrated in that, let's see if I can go back, in this region of western Kenya. Okay, so what are the challenges that these farmers are facing? Stem borers are a big problem, and there are many different species of stem borers. I forget, there's more than 100. I forget exactly how many there are. So that's the major arthropod pest. There are others, but that one is the biggest one that has the largest impact on yields. And then the other serious problem is striga, which is a parasitic plant. And striga actually, in addition to taking nutrients and carbon from the maize plant, striga is pathogenic. So it actually injects compounds into the plant that disrupt its metabolism. So the stunting of growth that happens, so here's the striga that actually attaches right to the maize root, are largely due to this disruption of metabolism and sort of a actual disease that develops. Striga has a huge impact on yields. I mean, it just can decimate yields. Once it gets into a field, it produces lots of seeds, and it can just keep spreading. So these are the challenges. And the push-pull system is basically, the idea is to manipulate the plants both in the field and sort of on the borders of the field to address these constraints that are impairing yields. And the work began in the 1990s, and at that point the focus was on the stem borers. And it began with screening a bunch of, especially grass species, to look for plants that would serve as trap crops, so that would attract the pests, and plants that would repel the arthropods. They were looking for both of these, and this is why it's called a push-pull. It's sort of named after the main focus of managing the insects. And this idea of push-pull systems has been around for, before the 1990s, and there was some work done in Australia. So this is not the only case where this approach is being used, but it is an example of an extremely effective case. So by accident, Zerkan discovered Desmodium. He was just, collecting seeds. He got some seeds for it, and he would screen, whatever plant species he was finding. And it turned out that Desmodium not only had a sort of a repelling effect towards the stem borers, but it also helped to control the striga. And this was a huge discovery, because when they first began promoting the system to farmers as a way of managing stem borers, it is ecologically, it is a somewhat complex system to manage. So growers need to learn how to actually manage it, and they do. And they also have contributed to some of the innovations, and I'll talk about that later. The farmers said, look, this is great that it controls stem borer, but if you can get rid of the striga, then we'll consider intercropping and doing this. So it's really a good thing that he found a plant that could actually effectively control the striga, because it by far is the has a greater impact on yields and is of more concern to the farmers. And of course, Desmodium is a legume. It's a perennial legume, so it has the added benefit of fixing nitrogen. And there's been a lot of improvements over time to the system from the beginning. So there's now multiple species that can be used, and the farmers have pushed some of this innovation by giving feedback on what they need. So here's just a diagram of how the system works, and there's been a huge amount of work on the chemical ecology, the entomology in the system, and very little work on the soils. So the Desmodium is planted in between the maize rows. They plant their maize fairly far apart, so they don't have to adjust the spacing in order to intercrop. They normally intercrop food legumes commonly, so common bean, for example, or groundnut. So they plant the Desmodium in the middle. This, to the arthropod, smells like a damaged maize plant. So that's, and there have been like 11 to 13 chemicals that have been identified that mediate these exchanges between the plants and the arthropods. So those act as the repelling plants. The stem borers, when they go out of the field, find the Napier grass, which is planted as a border around the field. That is a trap crop that attracts the stem borers. They lay their eggs in it. It's a super duper trap crop because it actually ends up killing 95% of the larvae. When the larvae hatch out on a Napier grass plant, they get stuck in some of the honeydew that the plant secretes. It's got like some sticky goo that it secretes near the base of its leaves. So many of them end up dying. So it reduces the population. And then the Desmodium also releases some root exudates that stimulate germination of the striga. However, it's a suicide germination. The striga germinates, but it cannot elongate to connect to the maize roots. So it ends up dying.
And why can it not elongate its roots?
Why can't it elongate the seed tube? I forget the technical name of it. Well, the chemical that's produced by the Desmodium for some reason stimulates it to germinate, but then there's not the next step that allows it to elongate. And I don't, that's about as far as I know, because there are a lot of mechanisms that are involved. I have a slide of that, but I left it out. So, yes. So that's the main part of the below ground work that's been done, though, is on the Desmodium control of the striga. So these are just, I'm going to show you some pictures. This is at the research station. There's several long-term experiments there. You can see the maize with the Desmodium, which is quite a vigorous grower, and it's managed in ways that reduce the competition with the maize in terms of the timing of cutting. This is also a forage. Napier grass also serves as a forage, and you can see that it's also susceptible to the striga, the purple flowers of the striga. And what's amazing is this is only like about 5 feet, and there's absolutely no striga in this field. The desmodium is incredibly effective at controlling the striga. This is one thing we're wondering about, is will there be over time, some adaptation in the striga to be able to overcome the desmodium, but so far there is no evidence for that. And I want you to notice the size of this Napier grass, because it's rarely on a farm do you see the grass get to this size. So this is one of the issues, that the farmers are harvesting Napier grass and the desmodium to feed their livestock. So early in the season, so the desmodium is cut back quite drastically when the maize is planted. So it's very small when the plants are small. And then as the maize starts growing, it begins to cover. But you can see it's much smaller than it was under the large plants. And then by the time the maize is large, it can be a very thick carpet and sometimes even grow upright. And this is out in one of the farms. So I want you to notice here's the very highly harvested border that's almost unrecognizable. And many farmers are over-harvesting these accessory plants. So this is one question that we want to look at, is how much harvesting pressure can these systems bear and still garner the benefits of the desmodium and the grass borders. And then this is an adjacent field, is another one of this farmer's fields that she hasn't transitioned to push-pull. And you can see the difference there. So the benefits have been documented extensively by work out in farms in terms of yield increases, the control of striga and stem borer, and a little bit of work on soil fertility. Most of the conclusions about soil fertility are sort of anecdotal or indirect and based on yield improvements, and the plants look more vigorous, and we know nitrogen fixation is going on. And that's one area I'm very interested in trying to actually document. There are significant improvements in livestock production because now there's better quality fodder for them and also more of it. So both of these plants serve as fodder, and this is a very important outcome and benefit, and one reason why farmers are interested in adopting this system. And as a result, there are some economic benefits. Usually the yields go up sufficiently, so there's extra maize for selling. And there's work going on now looking at how this all pans out in terms of human nutrition. So at this point, about 96,000 farmers have adopted the system, mostly in Western Kenya, but also in Uganda, Malawi, and Tanzania, particularly in areas where striga is a problem. That's and also some of the areas that are a little drier where there's other challenges. And ISIPE has been instrumental in disseminating this. They have a demonstration garden at the farm where they have the system at different stages. And I thought some of the extension folks might be interested in this, because this is a complex system to manage. And they can bring farmers there for intensive trainings, and they can show them, at this stage you need to do this, and at this stage you need to trim, this is when you trim the desmodium, and they can actually get practice doing some of these things. So they plant, they have irrigation, so they have at least sort of 6 plots that are at different stages when you would carry out different management. And they have a whole other sort of system of educators and materials. However, beyond their efforts, farmers have played an incredible role in disseminating this technology, which is probably important in the case of something that is this, complex to manage. And one of the most famous farmers is Sarah Obama, who I met. I thought they were kidding me when they said they were going to have me meet Sarah Obama. Thought, oh, they probably have a grandmother all over the country, and they tell Americans, you're going to meet Sarah Obama. But then I got there and I saw the sign, and I saw the military guarding her farm. So she was active at one point in some of the the push-pull dissemination efforts, but she's pretty low-key right at this point. So I want to show you some, I think this is where, I want to show you just if the video works. We didn't get to test it because of all the technical issues. So you're going to see 2 farmers, and these 2 farmers have been instrumental in disseminating the system. One of them organized, Mary, first one you're going to see is organized groups where they meet periodically, talk about what's working, talk about what they need to improve. They bounce ideas and problems off of each other. She's going to talk briefly about Striga. And then the next farmer is called the grandmother of push-pull by many of the farmers in the region, because she adopted, a bunch of farmers were invited to this meeting. And she was the only one that came. None of the men came. So she got trained in push-pull, and she's been training farmers in her community. So the push-pull farmers tend to be in clusters. She's going to talk in her own language about the push-pull and just, but show you she's got two fields, a push-pull and a non-push-pull. I'm going to have to.
Yes. Plot 5 is local. Yes.
And did you have Striga here before?
Yes, there was Striga. Yes, Striga made the shamba to be beautiful with the, I know yellow and pink flowers. Pink flowers. Yes.
Okay.
Yangu ya push pull na hii ni sio ya push pull.
And how long has the push pull?
Mzuri kwa sababu nilipandia mbolea lakini hapa mimi sikuwa na mbolea. Sasa ndio mnaona iko different namna hii.
She's attributing it to
I know she is, and you know how much she put on? An amazingly small amount. Yes, so she has had push-pull fields since 1999. She took out one and rearranged her fields, and that field has been push-pull since I think 2004, 2005. And sometimes they try to do experiments. So she did an experiment. She put fertilizer on her push-pull, and she's convinced that helped her yields.
That's what she said was. So
However, she put like 5 kilograms on the whole field. At least that's what we can understand. So this is the challenge of doing on-farm work, because we suggested, well, what if you put fertilizer on both of your fields? Because in many cases, we see fields where they are putting fertilizer on all of their fields. And on the field station, they put fertilizer on push-pull and non-push-pull. And it seems like the Striga is one of the main issues. Okay, so I'm working with pretty much all entomologists in the system. I'm very interested in what's going on with the Desmodium. It's a perennial legume. There's a lot of questions about how the nitrogen is being delivered to the maize. There's 2 possible pathways. And the entomologists are convinced that this is the important pathway, just because they know that legumes can, transfer nitrogen to non-legumes. But I actually think this may be important early on, but this probably is the major pathway later on, because we know that nitrogen is going to contribute to building organic matter, and that's another mechanism for delivering nitrogen. So these are the kinds of questions that I started out with. I was really interested in looking at how the Desmodium intercrop affects the flows of nitrogen and building organic matter, and then also looking at some of the other related benefits of building of the organic matter, and then understanding some of the sort of the ecology of nitrogen fixation in the system. There's several Desmodium species. There's a lot of variation in environment and also in management history. And if we can understand this, then we could actually make recommendations to the farmers about when they might need nitrogen fertilizer and when they may not need it. The evidence is that farmers are applying nitrogen fertilizer sometimes at high rates, mostly at very low rates, and that they're not really discriminating between their push-pull and their non-push-pull fields. So they may put just as much fertilizer on the push-pull fields where the legume is, when their other fields really might be nitrogen starved. And we were seeing some evidence that adding nitrogen suppresses nitrogen fixation. When we look at the Desmodium in fields where they put on a fair amount of nitrogen, we would just find very few nodules and not, active. And then some questions about how they use their land and how heavily they harvest these crops, especially the desmodium, and when can they start harvesting it heavily. So I'm going to go into some preliminary results. I started with sampling on the field station, and these are just results from 3 of their long-term experiments showing about a 30% increase in soil nitrogen. This is from the 20-centimeter depth, so basically the tillage layer. The kind of a surprising finding was this difference in extractable phosphorus. So both the push-pull and the non-push-pull systems, it's a tongue twister, have received the same amount of phosphorus fertilizer. But when you do extractable phosphorus, there's this significant difference between the push-pull and non-push-pull soils. And we haven't looked at the fractions and exactly where the phosphorus is, but that's something we're very interested in following up on.
Did you look at differences in pH?
I've measured pH. When I got there, there had been absolutely no soil measurements done, even on the experiment station. So the pH does not show a significant shift from push-pull to non-push-pull, except for in one experiment, which is the non-replicated experiment, the oldest one. And in that one, I think it's because some of the manure they added probably has some calcium carbonate in it. But it's very patchily distributed. And then, we would expect these differences in the organic matter pools to show up most significantly in the active pools, so the particular organic matter. And these are very important to look at because they do have the greatest impact on soil structure and on nutrient flow. So particularly the occluded particular organic matter could be an important source of nutrients. And for people that like to see this, so this is from the top 5 to 6 centimeters, just the sort of the difference in the amount of residue going into these soils. This is from the longest experiment, so that's the free particulate organic matter. And we took these pictures for extension purposes. And then the occluded particulate organic matter, which this is a big difference. To be able to see differences in these fractions is just a sort of a testament to how profound the impact is of having this perennial legume. So I was very interested in collaborating with them to do some work out on farms and see how this practice actually affects the farmers' soils. Because their practices, on the field station we could make critique. These are optimally managed. They are not aggressively harvesting the supporting plants. They are harvesting them and they are using them for fodder. They're harvesting them in the recommended way. Which is not nearly as aggressive as some of the farmers who have small land holdings and really need fodder for their livestock are doing. So the cluster that I've been focusing on in this initial work is located near the village of Vihiga, and this just gives you an idea of the landscape. And this area has a rainfall that's sort of in the higher to medium end of 1,000 to 1,200 millimeters. It is bimodal. And in this region, farmers have some very small holdings, fractions of hectares. So the size of the farms varies with the region. Some of the farmers in this region have 1/10 of an acre or so. But on the plus side, this is an early adopting region, I meant to say that. And that's partly because striga was a very severe problem in this area. So, and you can see lots of striga in non-push-pull fields out in this region. And there's some, fields. A lot of fields started between 2002 and 2005. So to do this on-farm research, we took fields and divided them into at least 3 replicates. And sometimes, if it was a large field, we would divide it in half and then divide those into 3 replicates. So the design, because there's some rolling topography and there are some changes in soil types that are, occur on a fairly small scale, our first priority was to try to match the soil types. And so the analyses will be, we'll use them as pairs in order to compare push-pull and non-push-pull effects. So I have some of the data from the farms, but not all of the sort of the background texture and all of that information. I don't have that yet. So we went out, divided them into these replicates and collected soil samples from 20 centimeters usually and made composite samples, at least 6 to 12 cores depending on the size. We interviewed the farmers briefly, and I was really dependent on the extensionist to help me because a lot of the farmers do not speak English. Mary is one of the exceptions. And so our findings on the farms are similar. They're similar to what we found on the experiment station, but much more variable, as you would expect, given the differences. So 5 out of 8 pairs showed an increase in the soil nitrogen and organic matter. In one case, it's reversed. And what we hope to do is to look at how environmental variation and also management practices, so the severity of the harvesting, how much is being harvested relative to remaining in the fields, and how that impacts these dynamics. We also found this same result with the extractable phosphorus, and I do know that in this pair, because these farmers are neighbors, that she applied phosphorus fertilizer and she did not. And the others, it is very hard to get accurate fertilizer information from farmers, and I think we've finally figured out a way to do it. I won't tell you what it is, but we've had better success when I went back this past June at getting information that we feel more confident. So that's kind of where we're going with that. And the last thing I'll show you with these preliminary results, and this is some of the early work to look at nitrogen fixation dynamics, and I'm in the process of trying to find funding because it's a pretty expensive proposition to do the isotope analyses that are needed for this. But I did do a survey and just looking at the delta N shift. So this is the delta N, and as it gets to be more positive in the desmodium, so in the nitrogen fixing plant, we can conclude that nitrogen fixation is being reduced. So it's the a reduced proportion of nitrogen is coming from the atmosphere. That's the interpretation. And we do see this positive relationship. The longer the farm or the soil is under push-pull, we know the nitrogen fertility goes up, and we would predict that that would suppress nitrogen fixation. The legume down regulates, and we see evidence for this, a pretty good relationship. There are some outliers. And this is where we would assume, my line's in the wrong place. If it was at 0, that would be 100% nitrogen fixation, which we don't normally see. How did that line move? A mystery. All right. Do I still have 5 minutes? Is that it? Okay. Now I'm going to talk even faster. No. So future directions. I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenges, because the farmers are playing a really essential role in overcoming some of the challenges. And one of the major challenges is access to the seeds or to the materials for these accessory plants. And I'm talking about the Napier grass, the Brachylaria grass, which is the other grass, and the desmodium. In particular, the green desmodium, which is a more drought-resistant species. They've had a very difficult time getting it to produce seeds in the climate in Kenya. They're sort of a problem that they've been wrestling with. And here again, the farmers have been playing a crucial role in this. This is Elizabeth. Oh dear, I'm forgetting her last name. Oh well. I have it written down. And so she has a nursery for the Bracharia grass. So she's been propagating this, and as part of her outreach work, disseminating this. So some of the farmers are actually hired. They receive a stipend from ASIPE to perform these roles of outreach, and they occasionally take it further and actually do problem solving, such as this. She realized the major issue is the farmers can't get a hold of the material. And I'm going to try to play one more video of, I'll show you her picture, of Urka Mitho. And her farm is pretty amazing. And when you're watching this video, you might want to just watch her expression while the extensionist is translating, because she's barely hanging on to not cracking up. Mitho farm. So here's her farm, and I'm at the lower push-pull field, and they've planted a lot of green desmodium at the bottom of this field, which has overgrown the Brachylaria grass, and it is full of flowers and seeds. And we took some pictures of the seeds. But I think they're having some very successful seed production. Yeah, so we don't know if it's the material they started with or something about the environment. And this is Rachel, who...
Yeah, so these are desmodium seeds for green from her desmodium field. She's trying to bulk to see if she can get seeds out of the green desmodium. So this is the seeds that she has been able to harvest from just a small part of her farm where she's trying out this. And this is just part of it. She's going to harvest more from her field. So this one she's going to put it to dry out before she can try to extract the seeds out of it.
Yeah, and that was Rachel. She's the extensionist from Mississippi that I work with most of the time, and she was also my translator. She did a lot of the interviewing. She engages in the social science research that they carry out and extension outreach. Okay, so future research directions, I promise I'll cover it in 2 minutes. So in terms of the work that I'm pursuing, I'm very interested in trying to do some more detailed work on nitrogen cycling in these systems to try to understand the flows and transfer of nitrogen to the maize. And I'm also working with some collaborators to look at some broader questions relating to below ground changes that take place in push-pull and how those affect the arthropods that are interacting with the plants. So particularly Andre Kessler is interested in how plant secondary compounds might shift and that may impact these interactions. And then there's a group of us that have been formulating an idea to do some research on the long-term sustainability in the push-pull systems, because there's a lot of questions that come up about the longevity and how effective, how these systems can continue to be effective over time. And these are, so this is sort of the core collaborators. There's Katja Poveda and Andre Kessler, who are the two Cornell faculty. They're both entomologists that I'm working with. And then the folks at ISIPE, there's Professor Kahn, who some of you may have, he's sort of periodically had appointments at Cornell. Dr. Charles Modega and Charlie, Pitchar, what? Jimmy Pitchar, my name's. And so, and he's carries out the social science research, so looking at the sort of dissemination of knowledge and how this impacts things like labor demands, and they're sort of getting into collaborating with some nutritionists. So we're especially concerned about two issues. One is, over time, as you increase the proportion of the landscape that's in these systems, how will that possibly impact the herbivores? Are these arthropods going to become resistant? Are you just going to overuse a mechanism and they'll adapt? There's many questions with that, and also climate change and how that's going to impact them over time. And the climate change issue is tied into this question about harvesting. How much pressure can you put on the system and have it still function? And so those are tied together. We see those as sort of the key pieces of the sustainability issue. And so I'll stop and say thank you and be happy to answer any questions or listen to comments you have.
Thank you.
No, they're all rain fed. Yeah, for the most part, there's not a means to irrigate. So in some cases, they may, have water for irrigation that they'll preferentially put on their home gardens, some of the intensive maybe vegetable crops right near the house, but not the maize.
Laurie, fascinating story. I just have a comment. Try to grasp your central hypothesis here.
Mm-hmm.
There's more diversity, more likely get higher yield, right? I mean, we can.
Higher yields in what? Well, the central hypothesis is sort of tied to energy and inputs.
Yeah.
But, oh, okay.
But it seems to me if the diversity is not any diversity, it's a managing diversity.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So
Yes.
We should reflect that. That should be reflected in this.
Right, and so this idea that just any old diversity will be good and, that's not really the way we view it. So there's a whole literature, and this, the hypothesis comes out of the natural ecosystems or unmanaged ecosystems work. So there's different metrics that we can use for diversity. And so functional diversity and phylogenetic diversity, those are two, they're sort of replacing species richness just simple number of species. So, good point. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Well, I concur with Lei Lang that there was a fascinating presentation both about drinkwater history and push-pull system. My question is, have you given any thought to the applicability of this push-pull system to American or North American agriculture?
Well, actually, I asked the entomologist about that. And so from the pest control angle, and if there's an entomologist here who wants to add to this or correct me, I think that it's probably not an option right now, mainly because of the maize genetics, the material we have that we're growing for corn. Because let's see, the signaling and the communication between the stem borers and the maize has been lost. So the stem borers, from what I can understand from Katya, the stem borers in the United States do not recognize the signal of, hey, I'm a damaged corn plant anymore, at least the same, yeah.
And with the
So the specific,
how could you ever put
yeah,
anything else in
right. Well, the specific system, and then there's other issues that is, with trying to add a perennial in between the maize rows and how that would work. So we have genetic material here that we're using that's really adapted for the system that's in place, which is, has these cascading effects on the structure. And I'm not going to kind of go into that anymore, but the broader question of using plant species, I think, is definitely an option that we will want to consider in even in intensified high-yielding agricultural systems. There are some, problems that we're running to, like especially in the pollination-dependent crops, where even under high input, intensive agriculture, yields are being impacted by the lack of diversity in the landscape and the lack of pollinators. And it can't really be overcome just by moving honeybees around. And it doesn't seem to be. And I think that if we want to try to expand the ecosystem services that we're going to get from agricultural lands, that this is one approach that we want to consider. And we want to think about, where do we really want to use nitrogen fertilizer? Because we do need it, but we could be strategic, because there's definitely systems where there's enough rainfall, enough of a growing season to grow some of our nitrogen, and then we would accrue these other benefits. So thinking about how do we, I think we just have to be strategic about where we, how we blend ecology with the inputs that have been developed. Yes.
One more question?
Two really quick ones. One, the Desmodium perennial, but is there any sort of rhizobial inoculation that happens, or is it just the native fact that the native rhizobium present?
Yeah, so far they haven't really been using inoculation. I don't know if that's because it's, promiscuous. There are some native Desmodium species that are in Kenya, and actually now, so the two they're using are from elsewhere, the most prevalent silver and green leaf. There's two, pardon? Yeah, right. Yeah. So there's two Desmodium species that are native of sub-Saharan Africa that they're evaluating right now. And I think that, taking advantage of these different ecotypes in Desmodium and also the different species of grasses that can fulfill this function is a good strategy.
That was actually my second question. In terms of the diversity of the Desmodium, are there is there variation for the amount of down-regulation of nodule formation?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's something I'm very interested in. We don't really know. So, right now the green Desmodium is being heavily favored because it's drought resistant. And we don't really know enough about the ecology of these species to know when might be beneficial to have the silver leaf. Like what is the difference in these in terms of how they perform in an intercrop? Some farmers are ending up with a mixture, which I think is probably a good way to capitalize, and because they've lost some of their silver Desmodium because of drought, and they've replanted with green, but they've left the silver that's there. So I think that'll be interesting to see how that pans out.
So we're over time.
Okay.
But I want to thank Laurie
Thank
again,
you.
and great presentation.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.